Well, it's good to be with you once again. And we have been, over the past little while, talking about having a biblical worldview toward the things in life. So for those of you who haven't been here recently or much, we're talking about the idea of a worldview. Now, worldview in itself is a relatively modern word. While it was originally used in the 1800s, its usage was very, very seldom up until you get to around the year 1980. From 1980 to today, it has exploded in use by 800%. And it's still probably not a word that you use every single day, but you will at least hear it kicking around a little bit. Now, part of that is because of the cosmopolitan nature of life today. And what I mean by that is that we are exposed to so many more cultures and ideas in life than we used to be. I've just come off a stint of traveling. And in Snyder County, we're still pretty isolated, although we're a little less so. But I can tell you that when you travel and when you get in the bigger cities, you really see how cosmopolitan the United States has become. Because I was in New York City and Portland. And those places are not as homogeneous as Snyder County, I'll just put it that way. Much more radical ways of thinking and living, certainly than you see here. But even here, we are challenged with the idea of, do we think biblically or non-biblically? And always the quest of our lives is that we would have our mind transformed and changed to think how God thinks. We were talking in Sunday school a little bit about how God is always right. Now because we believe that and understand that as Christians, we at least understand the nature of the problem. Sometimes people don't even understand that God is always right, and that creates a whole new set of difficulties. But this morning, we are beginning with that and understanding that what he presents in his word is what we need to align ourselves to. That's the start of faith, that's the start of wisdom, that's the start of understanding everything about life that we need to understand is to understand that we want to conform to the way that God thinks. Now, one of the big things that we find out there in life is the idea that we only live once. Now, there are two ways of thinking about that. How many of you know what YOLO is? Come on, I know the youngers do. If you're older, do you know what YOLO is? No, I guess you don't. Okay, I thought we'd get better response in that. I thought that word had penetrated the cultures more. How many of you don't know what YOLO is? I know. Okay, we got a couple. Okay, you don't. You probably will. Oh, you will. YOLO means you only live once. Stands for you only live once. Now, the idea is sometimes, and usually it's not meant as a warning, it's meant as, well, I only live once, so I'm going to make the most of it. That's how it's often used. Especially for younger generations, they use it more than older generations, because some of you don't know what it is. That's fine. It is used sometimes to justify risky, unwise, dangerous, or pleasurable behavior. In other words, you only live once, so you're going to get the maximum out of every second you can. Now, we may think, and YOLO is a pretty relatively new phrase, probably 15 years or so. If you're wondering how out of date your knowledge was, now you know. But like so many things in life, if you have a strong historical basis, you find that new is old. Because the concept behind you only live once is actually, would you be surprised that the first philosophers who came up with it are 2,500 years old? That the idea behind you only live once and therefore you should make the most of it, you should squeeze every ounce of pleasure you can out of life, is actually a very ancient idea. The first philosophical group that embraced it was Greek, and it was about 2,500 years ago, or around 500 BC, that they began embracing that idea. So that sounds pretty old, right? So old is new, new is old, once again. I want to talk about a modern, we're going to have a few quotes that I want to start with today. So I'm going to read a quote from someone who used to live that way, and will tell you a lot about the dangers of it, but from a very non-biblical perspective, I would say. But nevertheless, we'll use a quote from her site. Her name is A.O. the author, and I believe her name is A.O. something, but I couldn't find it on the page, so maybe that's on purpose on her part. But she says this: "You only live once is the motto for many people these days, especially my fellow millennials and those in Gen Z. The phrase, 'do what makes you happy,' can be interpreted as do anything that provides pleasure. Some people take it as do whatever makes you feel good right now, regardless of the consequences it creates in the future." So that is a mentality that exists very much in our culture today. But many of the things that we can do in the short term, we've all found out, can be very destructive in the long term. The Bible in Jeremiah speaks out of our heart as being desperately wicked. So that would suggest to us that many of the things that we want to do are actually a bad idea. We all know this in practice. I'm curious about this. I wonder if we'll get a better response in this survey. If you could eat ice cream every night, how many of you would? No consequences. Oh, you do? Okay. Well, we're proud of you, Tim. Most of us wouldn't look like you, though. So, aside from vacation, I don't normally eat ice cream every day. I don't even have any ice cream, although I was very tempted to get some, but I thought, you know what? After vacation, I'm not getting any for a while. It's going to remain an ice cream-free home. But that's because we know that there are some things that in excess of them will lead to destructive behavior, right? We all know that you can't have cake for breakfast every day. I know pancakes don't count. We understand that there are certain behaviors we can't always do because they are long-term destructive for our lives. Every impulse we have can't be followed because every impulse you have is not a good one. How many of you have ever refrained from giving someone a piece of your mind? Okay? Because you realized you couldn't afford it. You needed that piece still. The point is that we understand it to be true that we cannot do whatever makes us happy in the moment all of the time. Even as an adult, we've learned that. And yet, there is this certain temptation in the worldview today that suggests we should do whatever makes us happy, do whatever will bring us the greatest pleasure, do whatever we want. Because after all, that's what freedom is, right? Somewhere in my notes I thought I had something and now I can't find it. So I'm either going to have to do it from memory, which is not the greatest, or just hope that you know it better than I do. But I'm not sure if the demographic is going to help me out here. But there is a song that says, "I'm free to do whatever I want any old time." Anyone know that song other than me? All right, no help whatsoever today. But okay, it exists. I'm sure you would find it if you looked. Not a Christian song, in case you were curious. But there is that idea that is the meaning of life, or how we can have the best life that we would want to live. And yet, it is not. There's actually a name for that mindset. And it's not what we were talking about, self-denial. It's actually called a much different word, and you've probably heard it, but maybe you haven't. It is called hedonism. How many of you have ever heard hedonism? Okay, we got a couple. Couple takers. All right, that's good. All right. Hedonism is, as I said, an ancient idea, although refined in different ways. And today we are trying to live an even different way of it. But one of the foremost proponents of it, or the modern school of thought, is from the 1800s. A man by the name of Jeremy Bentham. All right, so let's just look a little bit at what he says here. He is what's called a utilitarian hedonist. Say that 3 times fast and see if you can succeed in not doing a tongue twister. All right, but he stated this: individuals have no goal, and he's talking about the meaning of life. Individuals have no goal other than the greatest pleasure, and thus each person ought to pursue the greatest pleasure. Jeremy Bentham, utilitarian hedonism. Now, setting aside how dangerous this could be, because we all know that certainly it can become ridiculous, because what if my greatest pleasure is punching people in the face? Should I then pursue my greatest pleasure at all times? Well, that would probably lead to 2 things. One, you wouldn't have any friends. Right? I mean, unless you just can't hit hard, then maybe you still have friends. But I don't know about you, but if I had a friend who decided to punch me every time they saw me, I might not visit them as often as usual, because it just isn't very much fun for me. All right? So we know, obviously, with certain things, and it becoming criminal in certain cases, if the thing that brought you the greatest pleasure was to shoplift, eventually that would catch up with you, right? So we can understand how there are some problems with that, but the ultimate problem is not even that, it is this. In the Bible, we are told that we were created for God's pleasure, not our own. And when we make ourselves or our ultimate happiness and our pleasure to be the highest goal of life, the highest goal of our attainment, we have completely missed the reason for which we exist. The other great problem, of course, and this you can't necessarily come to philosophically, but you do know experientially, is this. Often, we find that any pleasure we pursue begins to pall. That first day you have ice cream is great. The second, pretty good. But for me, at least, once I have it every day for a long period of time, it's no longer as good as it was the first day. Now, ice cream is an easy example. You think of something like drug use, and you find that people use certain drugs, but then it fails to give their body what they're looking for, so then they go to something else. Because the truth is, for just about any pleasure in life, it never maintains the same level of satisfaction that we think it will. And eventually, we have to turn to something deeper, stronger, faster, more dangerous, or perhaps more wicked to get the same level of gratification. But fundamentally, that is not even the problem. That's merely a practical observation of something that we know to be true. The fundamental is a worldview and an idea that is not biblical. The idea of self-indulgence, which is what we're talking about when we're talking about hedonism, is that it is contrary to how God wants us to think. And the reality is that when Christ came to earth and demonstrated what a life lived well should look like, he did not spend his life in self-gratification and self-indulgence. He spent his life in self-denial. He didn't even have ice cream. That's kind of scary, isn't it? Sad, maybe. I don't know. But what I want us to think about is when God himself came to earth, he didn't surround himself with all of the good things of life to enjoy life. Instead, he pursued a path that ultimately led him to the cross. I want to just look at the definition of self-indulgence before we go on to see what it means. It means this. It says, excessive or unrestrained gratifications of one's own appetites, desires, or whims. Now, what I am not talking about when we talk about self-denial is kind of what we might classify as living martyrdom, which is where we never do anything that gratifies any desire because we somehow believe that that is more holy. That's not. And often that leads the road to a kind of self-righteousness, which is often has other pitfalls and dangers to it. But a life of self-indulgence is not a life that God ever commends or recommends to us. Now, notice there, excessive or unrestrained. And what that means is we have no boundaries, we have no discipline, we have no self-denial of things that we have to deny in order to live the life, a godly life that he has called us to. Because a life without restraint is never a life that will please God. And ultimately, he teaches us self-denial because it is not only good for us, but it is good for others. If the hedonists were right, Jesus would never have lived as he did. Think about the miracles that Jesus did. If he had used the power of God for himself, would it have looked like his life looked? In fact, we were having this conversation in the car coming home, because our coming home yesterday did not go quite as planned. We flew into JFK, it's about 4 hours. We got in around 3:30 to 4. I figured we would be home by 8. New York City construction and traffic had a different plan. What should have been a half-hour journey through the city was a little more than 2 hours of people cutting in one lane in front of you and then cutting back in the lane in front of you, and you saying to them, well, it wasn't any more clear this time. And by cutting, we're moving 2 miles an hour, so there's a lot of honking and gesturing and some squealing from my passengers occasionally. Mainly my mom. But she was pretty good. But what I was thinking about there is, we were talking about after we had stopped to eat, and it was like 8 o'clock, and we knew we were going to get home around 11 or 10:30 or whatever. Oh, it's 10:30, but we shaved a little time off, because once we got past traffic, I might have moved a little. But we were talking about, how Philip was translated, and how, it would be nice for God to just pick up the car and move it to our final destination and save us a little time. Now, can God do that? Sure. We didn't even pray for that, because that would have been a self-indulgent prayer for sure. But God had the power, Jesus had the power to do that at all times. Who wants to walk a dusty road from Galilee to Jerusalem when you could just fly by Prayer Express or whatever it's called? But did Jesus do that every time? No. Jesus denied himself a lot when he was here. Jesus led us an example of self-denial. I want to talk about, before we get into that part, and that was a lot longer introduction than I planned, but that's okay. So let's get into the meat here. Let's get into Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 1, and we're going to look at 1 and 2 here in a second. But this is from the life of Solomon. Solomon lived a life unlike any that had gone before in one sense. In one sense, Solomon was the billionaire of his day. And what that means when you have wealth, youth, and power is that you can use it any way you want. Why? Because, well, he was the absolute monarch. That meant that he had no restrictions on his power. He had extreme wealth and he had youth. So he got all of that at around 20. Most of you are thinking, yeah, if I were given all of that at 20, I wouldn't use it too well. And he didn't. That's part of the lesson of Ecclesiastes, is he's warning us about the dangers of all of those things. And we're going to look first at Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 1 and 2. He says this, I said in my heart, this is what his mindset was and how he was thinking. Come now, I will test you with pleasure, enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. And I said of laughter it is mad, and of pleasure what use is it? What is the point? And at some point in life, because he had indulged every whim, because he had lived completely for himself, because he had walked in the ways that he thought would make him happy, all he ended up with, by the way, in Ecclesiastes is someone who's depressed, sad, and filled with regret. And that's not how you want to end your days. Chapter 2 goes through, and we're not going to make this a long study because I have other things I want to talk about this morning. So I just went on to list, and I want you to think about this. And they're pretty much the 9 things that we can all do or pursue that won't really give us what we think they will, but this is what he pursued. The first is wine, alcohol. That idea of let's forget it all. Great works. He was looking after fame, legacy, something that would last, something people will remember me by. People get sidetracked in that. Houses and gardens. Now, we all need a house, but he had a lot of houses. He had some big places to live, some big mansions. Sometimes we think that will make us happy if we pursue that. Then fruit trees, and he talks about all these things in abundance. It's the idea of, I don't know if you've ever met, and again, I might be using terms that are hard for some of you, but foodie. Do you know what that is? How many of you know what a foodie is? They love to try new stuff. They're always constantly looking for the next great flavor, or, and they're doing something weird like avocado ice cream. I don't know why we're on the ice cream kick today, but, I tell people I love every flavor of ice cream, but I don't think I'd like avocado. I'm just going out on a limb here. But anyway, slaves in abundance. Well, most of us don't have slaves anymore. We may think we are treated like one, or we may think we are one, but not really. But obviously it meant that he had other people to do all the work for him. So he had leisure time. Herds and flocks, that's how they measured wealth, as well as silver and gold, money. And then singers, entertainment. And then concubines, that was all about sex. Well, if you look at all of those things, truthfully, you see that in the world today, people still pursue all of them. They usually just don't get to do all of them at the same time. The idea of hedonism is you pursue one of these areas that you think is going to make your life better if you focus on that, and that's all you pursue. And at the end of all of that is, as Solomon tells us, sorrow, depression, and regret. Because ultimately a life of self-indulgence never brings us the promise that we think it will. It fails to deliver on the happiness that we think it comes with it. True happiness in life, and this is hard for us to understand, the way that we are wired and geared, actually comes from denying ourselves. I suppose that's what God did. Sometimes we can think of it in different ways. But one of the conclusions that I've come to, and it makes a lot of sense to me, is this. God didn't just do what is right because that is best, but also because it is best. God is good, not just because that is who he is, but it is so good to be good. Can I use that way? Goodness, mercy, love are the things that really bring joy and happiness, that bring what we're truly looking for. And God is all of that. And so when he's calling us out of the nature that we have, it's not just a matter of it is best for the world or best for God, but it's also best for us. And what he presents in a biblical worldview is normally and often so contrary to how we think, how we live, how we want to do, because we're fallen. And it's a matter of he's redeeming us from that which is disastrous and calling us to something that is so much greater. The problem is often that we have the wrong kind of love. And we see this in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 4. We read here in a list of many things that God was saying were wrong, many characteristics of people that are not serving him. And he says this. He says that they are... Okay. I guess we're going to have to try again. For reasons known only to you. Lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. There's a unique thing about love. We can tell what people really love. And often that's important to make a connection, but it's also a revelation. And I'll tell you, I'll share just a little story with you. I was meeting a cousin and her husband, technically not for the first time, but the last time I saw her, I was 11 and she was 3 months. So now that she's in her 30s, you'll all agree that even if I had known her at 3 months, it wouldn't be much help. True? And I'd never met her husband before. And, we were kind of sitting at a family gathering. And the best way to get to know someone is to get them to talk about something that they love. And he let something drop, and so then I could figure out something that I knew would get him engaged. And so I purposely pushed it in that way because I knew, and once he started talking about something that he loved or was interested in, I could connect with him and understand him a lot better. The truth is that what we love is something that we will know about, that we spend time on, that we have energy on, that we commit our finances to, that we have affection for. And my question for all of us is that if somebody looked at our lives, into which of these categories would we fall? Would they conclude that you loved pleasure more, or would they conclude that you loved God more? If you love pleasure more, then you are really imbibing the idea of hedonism, that is the greatest goal in life, that's your number one priority. Whereas we are called to be lovers of God, because when he talks about this, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, he's not revealing it as something that's good. He's saying that is not something that you should be. I can't answer that question for you, but it would be wise if we answer that question with God. Spend some time this week contemplating it. What would people see if they saw us? What would they think of us? What would the evidence say? If you were to sit down and write about your plans, your goals, your life, where would God and his people and his mission come into it? Will he only get the leftover? Jesus instead presented to us a way of self-denial. His whole life was the epitome of that. He came to a lowly family, to a life of hardship. He knew hunger, thirst, fatigue, sorrow. But even more amazingly to me, he had the power to choose that. You know, sometimes we don't necessarily have the power to choose that. We can't always alter everything in our lives at once, for sure. Whereas he always could. But he lived a pattern of self-denial. And we're all thankful for that. We are all the recipients of the benefit of Christ denying himself. But what I want you to understand is that before Christ even went to the cross, he began to talk to his disciples about the way in which they were to live as followers of him. Now, if you think about even that idea of being a follower, there is someone who went before you or goes before you when you're following, and you're supposed to follow in their steps. Now, I walked quite a bit of trails this week. Someone asked me, what do you do in Oregon? Well, one of the things you do in Oregon is you do some walking. Because they have mountains, they have lots of places to hike, tons of waterfalls. I mean, if you love waterfalls, that's the place to go. But one of the things you learn is, often you're walking single file in a group, and if you see someone slip on something in front of you, you pick a better path, right? Or if they're doing well, you follow their path. But in this sense, we're thinking about Christ as the one who was the leader who went before, and we are supposed to follow in his footsteps. We are supposed to follow his path. And one of the things that his path involved was self-denial. He did not live a life of hedonism. He did not live a life saying, well, you only live once, so I'm going to make the most of it. I'm going to get every ounce of pleasure and fun out of it I can. He didn't even end up with how we define success. Did he have a big church when he left? I wouldn't call 12 to be very many. Okay, 11, my wife says. Well, I guess it depends on how you count. Guess you lost that one. He wasn't wealthy. Didn't have a home. Not even his whole family believed he was Christ at that point. There was a lot of things, if you looked objectively from the way we might judge things, you wouldn't say that there was no reason to believe that Christ lived a life that was going to change the world more than any other. Let's look at Luke chapter 9, verse 23 and 24. Our final point this morning. We're going to read these sections. He said, and he said to all, if anyone would come after me, in other words, if anyone would follow me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. I've preached from this verse before in a few different ways, but I want you to note the way in which the pronouns are used. He doesn't say take up the cross. We all think about looking to the cross where Christ died. That's not what he's talking about. He's personalizing it. And those pronouns, by the way, are there in the Greek. It's not one of the things that was just added to make sense for us. Let him deny himself. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, I'm glad we're not reading from one of those gender-neutral Bibles because all the women are excluded. But don't think that way. Because I'm sure that it was not how Jesus intended it. He's only speaking to men. No, he's speaking to all of us, but he is making it personal. And he's saying that you are to take up your cross daily and follow me. And that, in one respect, is going to be different for each. That's why he didn't give us a whole list of what we had to deny ourselves in. I know that for each one of us, that looks different. And it's because we all have different tastes and different interests. So I could preach a sermon about just about anything, and some of you would be okay and some of you wouldn't. As long as I don't preach anything to me, right? Because if I tell, if we have to deny ourselves, if I were to, just for fun, we'll go food. If I were to say you have to deny yourself coffee, that would be easy for me, hard for you. If I had to deny myself peanut butter, that would be hard for me, and some of you would be really easy. It's not so much about what it is as it's a matter of what personally it is in our lives. For some people, you have to deny yourself to go to work. Some people, you have to deny yourself to stay home. It just depends on who you are and how you're wired. The issue is not about what it is we have to deny. It's about the mindset that reminds us that sometimes we have to deny ourselves. That to follow God is always going to cost us something. Because we cannot follow every inclination and desire, because many of them are not right. And while he's in the process of redeeming us, while he's in the process of transforming us from the inside out, sometimes the only way we can truly experience that transformation is if we say no to something we want to say yes to. And instead, say yes to God at whatever he wants us to say yes to. Because many times the problem is we can't take the opportunities he wants us to take because we're too busy with our own opportunities, our own priorities, our own desires, our own indulgences. The next verse, verse 24. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. Start again. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. This is one of the great mysteries of life. The more we seek to hang on to our own happiness, our own pleasure, even our own lives, the more it slips through our grasp. And I don't know why that is true. Have you ever noticed, and maybe you haven't met them, good for you, but I've met a few, who have lived their lives completely for themselves, and at the end of it, you never find anyone more miserable. Even though their whole thought was to be happy. Now, isn't that a strange thing? You would think that if you lived your whole life to be happy and you ended up miserable, that something wasn't working. And what I want us to see, and in some ways it's so simple but so profound. God and Jesus, who is the representation of God, did not live for himself. And yet at the end of even his life on earth, going to the greatest death, his number one theme in the last few hours in the book of John is about joy and peace. How is that even possible? I would submit to you that it is because denying ourselves actually brings joy and happiness. which I know is very contrary to the way we would think and to the way the world tends to operate. I don't know, I'm a little strange, but this is probably the longest vacation I've been on in so long. And we managed to keep busy enough that it wasn't too bad. But normally after about 4 days of doing nothing, I can't do nothing anymore. It's too much nothing. I'm sure some of the rest of you are wired similarly. I know a few of you are. And I think there's something about that in life. Part of what makes things work best is when we don't focus completely on them. When we are focused on denying ourselves, we will actually find that we've gained so much more than we can imagine. I know this to be true. A life of self-indulgence will never bring the happiness, joy, and peace you are looking for. A life where we are willing to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow Christ will bring so much more happiness and joy than you can imagine. If you make pleasure your goal, it will be an ever-moving target that you will never attain. On the other hand, if you choose to live biblically, to take up your cross, to deny yourself, you will find peace, joy, happiness, pleasure of God in your life, a deep sense of fulfillment, and a love for God that will mean so much more to you than anything else. That's what he offers instead. Don't take the substitute. It's cheap. It's almost free. They're almost giving it away. But in the end, you'll find it's not worth anything. Let's think biblically. Instead of self-indulgence, think of self-denial. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not being hypocritical. I'm not saying don't ever go on vacation because it's fun. That would be hard to do coming off vacation, right? It's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is it's a matter of priorities. And it's a matter of being willing to give up sometimes even something that we think is good if God asks us up for it. Knowing that if we deny ourselves, if we follow him, that we will never regret it. And that what he offers is always so much greater. Don't go for the substitutes. Stevia may come with a lot of promise, but it sure ain't sugar. Are you allowed to use 8 from the pulpit? I'm not saying it's exactly like that, but I am just reminding us that what God teaches us is of so much greater value. Let's pray, and we'll have Jeff come and lead us in a song. Father,